without further ado, let me introduce this morning's speaker. As usual, you have a biographical sketch before you of our speaker, and I won't repeat all of the many accomplishments that Dr. Wendy Gramm has enjoyed in her life. Suffice it to say that she has had a very distinguished career. She is married, has been married 24 years now to one of the most powerful men in the country, Senator Phil Gramm. But interestingly, I had the pleasure and privilege of being with her last evening, and what animates Dr. Gramm and fills her with most pride is when she starts talking about her children. And what that tells me is that despite the problems that we have in this country, when one gets that excited and that animated and that obviously filled with pride when you're talking about the children, she is an optimist because I think she foresees a good country and a good society for her children. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Wendy Gramm.
I was telling Griff last night that since my second son went off to college last year, I've been telling all my friends that I have 2 more kids than you think you can stand. So I was telling him he needs to have at least 2 more. And that he'll be glad when his kids start going off to college. Of course, my friends are all going around, get away from me, get away from me. But when your kids go off and go away to college, you'll say the same thing. But I'm pleased to be here. You know, Tom Jefferson said that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And when he said that, he wasn't talking about the Brits. He wasn't talking about the frontier and folks out there and all the dangers. What he really was talking about was government. The only real threat to our freedom and our individual liberty is government. And so I want to thank you today because you represent people who are foot soldiers in that army that is maintaining the vigilant stand there to protect our liberties and our individual freedom from the potential oppression of government. And the words that were uttered by Thomas Jefferson so long ago are ever more relevant today, unless you think that they're not. There are a few indicators. Let's start with the federal level. I think it's unusual that when you have 65% of the country, of the average population, by many, many polls, and this was weeks ago, and these polls were being reported in Washington, D.C. 65% of the American people, by many polls, are saying we ought to wait on health care. It's too complicated. We don't know what these new plans are. Even people who are for nationalized health care systems said we ought to wait and see what these new plans are all about. But yet every day I ask Phil, especially if I'm going out of town, I say, Phil, what's going to happen on health care? Because that's the first question I'm going to get. And he never would know. So it was that close in Washington. The debate in Washington about what was going to happen to health care was still up in the air, not predictable. We might have a nationalized health care system. But yet 65% of the American people were saying, wait a minute. What does that tell you? It tells you that people in Washington are trying to run your lives even though you don't think so. These are your elected officials, our elected officials. So they're trying to impose something from the top down. That's the problem with Washington, D.C. It's the problem at the federal level and also at the state level and the local level. Now, the advantages of the state and local level is that that government is closer to the people and therefore can be more responsive to the people, but you still have a lot of the same incentives. And that is, I think what we're seeing right now is more and more people are beginning to realize that our elected officials, government by the people, for the people, etc., that somehow they're not getting the message up there and they're trying to impose their programs, sending them on down, and, to heck with the average person. That's why this Georgia Public Policy Foundation is so important, because it's providing input to state officials about what average general Americans think is important, the public interest. The interesting thing, because you should know that there are public policy institutes that have sprouted up around the country. Florida has one, Texas has one, and I've seen this pop up around the country, and they've been popping up in response to increased government controls at the state level and the need in the different states to have a voice that is counter to just all the special interests, to have somebody who's speaking for the public interest and saying, here are what people think. Let's look and give some rational, careful analyses of the issues that you have to deal with. The interesting thing about the Georgia Foundation, this one, it's a little different, is that it has a broad membership base. Well, Georgia's also interesting because a lot of your regulators in state government are elected officials. And so when you marry the two, what you have is not only position papers and a lot of careful analysis about the impact and the cost of laws and regulations and what the government is doing, what the state government is doing, but you also have people behind it, membership, that gives it a little political power, little p, all right, that says, you know, not only are these careful analyses, but there are also some people here. And it also means that when you look out in a group of people and you say, come to a breakfast to a potentially elected official, they're going to be willing to listen a little bit more carefully because you represent constituents of people that they're supposed to be representing. It brings government down to them. And I think that's what's unique about this foundation. And I want to just say thanks for being involved to folks like Hank McCamish, who had really the foresight to start this and put money and time and effort behind it in the beginning, to people like Jack who are helping keep the expenses down, and the other newcomers who are helping with funding, and all of you who are helping with your membership and your interest, because all of that matters. Phil used to say a long time ago, back when he first got into politics, way back in 1976, he said, you know, those of us who benefit from our American system of government are very often not very good salespeople for our system. That those who benefit from free markets and free enterprise and free trade, we're so busy with the business of making money, providing for our families and our communities, that we don't get involved in what's happening at the governmental level, in getting involved in the public policy debates of the day. And when people would go out and try and raise money for institutes like these, you wouldn't get a lot. And I think what's happened is that this is an example of how that's changing over time. But it takes real leadership and effort. As a matter of fact, I go out, and usually when I'm speaking around the country, I'm talking to groups, and I'm talking to Chamber of Commerce groups and things like that, and I'm saying, the problem with the private sector is we tend to ignore government. You know, we wish it would go away and just leave us alone, and we don't want to have to deal with the yuck issues of the day, meaning regulations and all that kind of stuff. And my message is, get involved, folks, because government is really powerful and can do a lot to you if you don't watch out. With this group, you're sort of already here, and I appreciate the fact that your presence here indicates that you already have an interest. I don't have to give you that part of the message anyway. But I do think it's worthwhile to explain a little bit about why government works the way it does. I spent 10 years in government, almost 11 years in government. I went there kicking and screaming, because I'm mostly an academic, you know. And when Reagan was elected, my friend Jim Miller, who was a professor at Texas A&M for a few years, and he's a Georgian, you know, he's a Georgia Bulldog. And he said, Wendy, I'm trying to run the Federal Trade Commission. Why don't you come and help? We need some good economists. And I said, yuck! I don't want to be a government bureaucrat. I'm against the government. This was 1981. And he said, no, I really need some help. Phil said, yuck, I don't want to be married to a bureaucrat. But Jim Miller worked on me for 5 months. And finally, I said, okay, Phil, forget it. I'm going to try this. Instead of always complaining about government, why not see if I can't be part of the solution? And besides that, we live in Washington. I'm an economist and an academic, and, you know, I should see what it's like. It's like an experiment, right? And do my civic duty as well. So I said, well, I'll go and I'll work in government, maybe for a couple years, and see what it's like. Wow. I worked at the lowest level that you could get in at the Federal Trade Commission, down at the staff level. And didn't take me but 3 weeks, and I was hooked. It's fascinating, interesting issues. Oh yeah, I felt like I was beating my head against the wall, but fascinating. And I stayed in government. When Jim Miller went to OMB, I handled all the regulatory stuff at OMB. And then they asked me to head up the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which regulates financial products, right after the crash. And it was fascinating. I'm glad to be retired, I'll have you know. But I've learned a lot, and especially the last 5 years at the CFTC, here was an agency that I ran, and so I used it as a little bit of an experiment, you know, my little own experiment about could I really take this agency and move it in a direction, lead it in a direction it didn't necessarily want to go, okay? And this was a good agency by government standards, and really it was not as regulatory and awful as some of those other awful agencies. It was a small agency, it was manageable, etc. And I learned a lot. And yeah, I moved it a little bit in a direction that it didn't want to go, but it was tough. And I think there's some insights there that are useful, that are useful also, not only at the federal level, but also useful at the state level, also useful for business people to understand how government works. I think one of the most important characteristics about government bureaucracies is that bureaucrats are risk averse. We get beat up all the time if we make a mistake. Okay, so we don't want to make a mistake. Think of the poor guy who's a scientist at the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, and he's looking at a new pharmaceutical. His biggest fear is he's going to let something go through that's going to have a bad side effect. All right? If he does, he's going to get beat up on. Nobody's going to say, thank you for letting this through a week early, or a month early, or a year early. They're going to say, why did you let that thing go through that had that side effect? And so what is that scientist going to do? He's going to require another test. He's going to ask more questions. He's going to be a little bit more perfectionist to protect himself or his boss from getting smushed by some member of Congress or by the press. So it's not that they're really wicked or evil or slothful or lazy or slow. Some of them are, to be sure. But it's that they're risk averse and they don't want to get bashed. Nobody's going to say, you know, look, you did a good job by letting this out earlier. The people who are suffering are actually who die because there's some pharmaceutical that could have helped them locked up in FDA. Well, what's their voice? Do they talk loud? Not very. Right, so we tend to avoid mistakes. And that goes for the FDA, it goes for the CFTC. You know, my staff used to come up to me all the time and they say, what happens if you approve this new process or this new screen-based trading system or this new product and somebody gets defrauded or something goes wrong? They're going to blame you, Madam Chairman, and what are you going to do when you have up there before Congress and they're saying, Madam Chairman, how did you let Aunt Agatha lose all her money on this new product? So their inclination is to say no or to ask another question, take a little bit more time. And think about it. Innovations, by their very nature, come from the private sector. Government's not thinking innovations. And innovations, by definition, are new. It's something they hadn't seen before, right? So it doesn't fit in that peg. They say, well, we approved that last time, and this is just like it, so okay. But it's a little different now, and it could have a problem. And there could be a potential for a problem. I've heard that 1,000 times. There's a potential for fraud here, a potential for a problem. And we can't let that potential go. So we're going to add a regulation here, make them change it here, take a little longer. Well, you know, pretty soon you're stifling all your innovation or over-regulating. I used to tell my staff, drive them nuts. I'd say, we have this great garden. We're gardeners. this garden has produced a lot of fruits and vegetables. And that's very good for everybody, all right? However, we're also weeders, because there are weeds that can pop up, okay, and can really hurt the garden, and we gotta make sure that the weeds don't take over the garden. But if we pull up everything green, because it could turn into a weed, pretty soon we're not gonna have much of a garden left. That's how I tell that story every time they say we gotta get rid of the potential for any problem. You cannot do that and have innovation occur. And I used to tell them, forget about Congress. My job is to get beat up on as a political appointee. That's my job, is to sit up there and let Congress say all these awful things about how Aunt Agatha lost $100 or how this new product, derivatives, oh my goodness, right, created the stock market crash, etc. Let me answer those questions. Don't you worry about that. You do the right thing. But let's not stop all innovation because we're afraid of taking that risk. I'll give you a little story. Back when I was at OMB, I went to OMB in 1985, second part of the Reagan administration. And talking about FDA, they have been trying for 5 years to get the FDA to speed up their drug approval process. And there was a proposal. What we wanted them to do was to take, under these conditions, for pharmaceuticals, for ailments that are life-threatening, and not only life-threatening, but immediately life-threatening ailments, for which there were no alternatives, no alternative therapies. Immediately gets rid of cancer and, heart problems, because there are other alternatives. Immediately life-threatening, for which there are no alternatives. The manufacturer agrees, because it won't mess up his continuing tests, that the pharmaceutical has been through phase 1, which means it's passed the safety part of the test, hasn't gone through the efficacy part, which is, does it do what you claim it's supposed to do, right? That under those conditions and informed consent with the physician and the patient, that these drugs in this stage can be used by patients with immediately life-threatening diseases. Now, you'd say, golly, I mean, is that hard? Why not do it? They've been working on it, trying to get FDA to write this regulation for 5 years in the Reagan administration. All right, this wasn't even Kessler. This was a good FDA commissioner. And it was tough. He wouldn't do it. So I said, okay. Vice President Bush had kind of reactivated this task force on regulatory relief. So I said, I'll tell you what, we're going to take it to the task force. And I want Commissioner, the head of the FDA, to look, Vice President George Bush, who was going to be President Bush, we knew by that time, I want him to look him in the eye and say, I will do this regulation. Social pressure, we had other people on the task force who were also right-minded and would talk about and support the reasons why this is a good proposal to do, that this would generate a lot of benefits and not a lot of costs, and not even a whole lot of risks. So anyway, with social pressure, we brought the commissioner, and let me tell you, it was kicking and screaming. And he did talk to people at 3 o'clock in the morning before the meeting, et cetera, worrying about whether or not he would have to step down. But ultimately, social pressure prevailed, and I would like to think other good arguments. But he did, when asked if he would write this rule and work on this rule, he said yes, he would. And then the vice president asked, can you do it in 60 days as opposed to 90 days or 120 days? And he said yes, he could. Literally, Frank Young, the head of the FDA with 3,000 employees, or however many he had, and a special assistant, had to write the whole rule themselves practically because the staff really wouldn't do it. And you kept hearing about improvements on that rule as we went through, and in the quail, in the Bush quail years, the Quail Competitiveness Council improved and expanded on it. And really, part of the reason why this rule, we were able to get them to agree to do it, was the fact that one of the drugs, and really the only pharmaceutical that would be affected by it, was in the process, and it was an AIDS drug. And I think it was AZT, but at the time, the people who were, some of the doctors who were doing the tests were saying, this drug looks so promising that I don't want to give placebos to part of the control group. They should be getting the AZT. And so they're starting to build a lot of political pressure on the outside, and I always wanted to write an op-ed about how, politics makes interesting bedfellows, of the Reagan regulators or the Reagan deregulators and the AIDS activists working together to get this product through. And really, I think that because of that, we're able to get it through. And I thought that was an interesting vignette, because otherwise, I don't think that we could have gotten it. The AIDS activists did a few demonstrations in front of FDA and things like that, and Congress didn't come down and stomp on us too badly and write something into a law saying, don't write this rule. So, but that tells you something, right? It really exemplifies the difficulties that bureaucrats feel. And part of there are a couple other things that are related to this risk aversion notion. First of all, you got to deal with the press, and you got to deal with Congress. And when you're talking about the press, you're talking about trying to get ideas down into 10-second sound bites. When you're talking about Congress, you're talking about getting ideas down into, a 10-minute attention span. So you try talking about some of these issues, from Clean Air Act to derivatives, and getting it on a one-pager. Not so easy sometimes. You got to really communicate clearly and simply, etc. And just to give you an example, there were, back over my years, I used to talk about how one anecdote makes a regulation, 2 anecdotes make a law. It's true. Something bad happens and you get a regulation. Doesn't matter that the regulation is well thought out and has the impact and the effect, that it passes a cost-benefit test. It's we got to do something, and what are you going to do to make sure this never happens again? I mean, my first month at the CFTC, it was answering questions like, what are you going to do to prevent the stock market from ever dropping again? Mind you, that was too much volatility if stock prices fell. If they went up fast, that was just a market readjustment, you understand. But definitely too much volatility if the stock prices fell. And other odd things, like if the price of cattle or corn falls, that's also too much volatility. But if the price of oil goes up, now that's too much volatility. And coming from Texas, I'm saying, wait a minute, guys, you don't understand. But still, I got used to those kinds of, 10-second sound bites. What are you going to do to prevent this from happening? What are you, one year it got real cold and the price of oil went up because it got real cold. We had to testify, literally had to testify, different states through the Northeast, about what were you going to do to make sure the price of oil didn't go up. And we said, now wait a minute, it got cold. And when you have cold spells, the price of energy goes up, and it causes people to conserve. It causes a supply of oil and energy supplies to increase in response to the price. Does this sound like economics 101? Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of response you want, because then, it gets rid of the problem ultimately. Gently telling these folks that even if we would like to control the weather, that in fact there were other authorities that had greater power than we did. We weren't quite that powerful. But really having to, in Congress and the press, the special interests, those folks who want to petition government in order to have more regulations to impose costs on their competitors. It's always like, I'll tell you something, at the Federal Trade Commission, all the false advertising cases, all the complaints came not from consumers who thought they were defrauded, but who did it come from? It comes from one big company complaining about the other big company's ads. That's false. Do something about it. Sue them. And we'd always say, you sue them. If you think they're false, you sue them. Don't go to Big Daddy and, but they want government resources to go out and sue them. And all of those things work on the bureaucrats. And yeah, I could spend a little time too, and I'm not going to, but all the other incentives for bureaucrats to expand their authority, to spend their money because they're going to get more next year, to sometimes to abuse their power, they all exist too. I used to think after I got in government, And the longer I stayed in government, as a matter of fact, I would keep marveling about how can Milton Friedman be so right about what he said about bureaucracies, never having spent any time in government. And mind you, this comes from an academic who's used to learning things from books, right? And even so I'm saying, God, he's so right. And I'll give you a little example and just leave it at that. Because I don't want to just bash bureaucrats. I was a bureaucrat, and I am sympathetic to the incentives, et cetera. But right before I came to the CFTC, there was a period about 4 months where there was an acting chairman, mind you. They knew I was coming, okay? It wasn't like it was unknown. And just in case you think that leaderless agencies don't do anything, in those few months right before I came, they opened a major case against a major money center bank that basically said that these kinds of products, commodity swaps, they were oil swaps, are illegal. They want me to bring that case. The problem with that is that you can't distinguish really. A commodity swap is just like an interest rate swap. And basically, if we brought that case, and bringing that case and opening the investigation and going along as far as they did, basically threw into question all interest rate swaps that banks were doing in very large numbers. Banks were changing their variable rate into fixed rate streams, and this was something a very multi-billion-dollar business, and calling those things into question, not only sent commodity swaps overseas immediately, but called into question a very large part of what banks were doing at that point in time. I mean, we could have caused chaos in the banking industry. I mean, there would have been many more banks who failed had they gone forward on that. They did that. I mean, major, important case that they were working on. They didn't actually bring the case until 1 week after I got there. They presented me with the case and said, let's bring this case. But they started work on it, investigated, and of course the word got out. The other thing they did was they wrote a rule, and they proposed a rule that expanded their jurisdiction, that called into question, said they ought to, regulate all these other things, a lot of these new innovative kinds of hybrid instruments, what are called hybrid derivatives. That was a major policy proposal that they popped out a month before I got to the agency. You'd think they would have had, the decency to wait and see what I would have thought. They also promoted themselves. The senior staff all popped up to the next level, and then they got the acting chairman to agree that when they went on overseas trips, that they could go business class. That got changed real quickly. They did ask me as soon as I got in, they said that this was what the commission practice was, and what did I think of it, and I told them about Dickey Flat and how this would not pass the Dickey Flat test. That is, when I fly to Texas, I fly tourist class, and so I thought that as government bureaucrats, they should fly at the back of the plane just like everybody else did. And using taxpayers' money, we ought to be careful how we use that money. I mean, those are just 4 little examples of what happened in this short little month about. And again, this is in anticipation. So there are things like that do happen, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that. I do think that what is important for government is that we always, not only do we get a lot of people who are interested and involved in watching what government does so they do the right things from a policy perspective, which is what this is all about, but also that we understand how government works too, because and I would also urge you guys to get into government. Go do it. Don't get at some fancy position. Go in as a staffer. I mean, you really see how government works. It'll give you a new perspective. You will learn a lot, and I think it'll be very helpful in the future in understanding how government works and how you can affect government as well, because government will affect you if you don't work to influence the decisions that they make. So the experience that I had certainly was worthwhile and fascinating as well. It'll give you a new appreciation of how government works. People always say that I'm a little bit of a schizophrenic in that I think when I think of what the optimal size of government is, I think that government today is many, many times bigger than the optimal size of government. All right, that we really need to cut the size of government. It is way too large and way too intrusive in our lives and how we run our businesses. But yet, even as if someday we are able to get government to a smaller size, we also still have to work in the interim to make sure that the government that does exist, at least to the best that we can help it, does the right thing. Let me end with a personal note and then take some questions if you have any. That people often ask, why am I such a free market person? Is it that I'm an economist and I spend all that time reading Adam Smith and Milton Friedman? Or is it that I taught Aggies for all those years and that really helped convince me about how markets work? Or is it that my time in government, where you really saw how governments work, and that certainly opened my eyes. And I say, well, all of that's really part of the answer, but I also have some real evidence about the role of government and also the role of markets and the American system and what it really means. And I've got that evidence in my family. And some of you may have heard this. If you've ever heard my husband speak, he always uses this story, but it really is my story, and I'm the one who told it first. But it's a good story. And it's a story of my grandparents. Because my grandparents came to Hawaii from Korea at the beginning of the 20th century. And they came basically as your new indentured servants. They paid for their way over on the boat by agreeing to work in the sugarcane fields for a certain number of years. They weren't particularly talented and they weren't particularly brilliant. But they came to this country looking only for freedom and for opportunity, and certainly not looking to government for anything. Yet when my father retired, he was vice president of that same sugar company where my grandparents went to work so long ago. And as chairman of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, President Reagan and President Bush would often say that, well, I regulated pork bellies, stock index futures, and also cane sugar futures. Now that's what America's all about. And that vision of what brought my grandparents to this country is something very much worth fighting to preserve and protect. So thank you very much for all of your efforts in this battle. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Yes? Okay, the question was, and I've been asked to repeat the question because I think they're taping this. We have the incentives from the bureaucrats. Why would Congress do something stupid? Okay? Well, it's very interesting because the congressional incentives, they respond to the press too, okay? And now we can all talk about the press being liberal, etc., but the press is biased towards more regulation. They're biased to the story, the great story about how something bad happened to somebody because of this product or this, new pharmaceutical, etc. So unfortunately, they don't have the depth of knowledge or the time to spend really looking into things. And unfortunately, I don't think they understand economics or free markets either, and that doesn't help, okay? So they also tend to listen to some of these folks that claim to be for consumers. They're quote, consumer groups. They're not consumer groups. The consumer groups don't often speak for the average consumer, the person whose price is going to go up or his tax is going to go up by 10 cents. That's your average consumer, right? But they're those special interest groups, so that's who they listen to. And so Congress responds to that. It's amazing. If you want to know what the press is saying, you can talk to a congressional staffer or the press. I mean, if you want to know what Congress is thinking, you can talk to the press and find out that they're very much linked. And so it's the same thing. Press will ask the congressman, what are you doing, Mr. Congressman, to prevent that from ever happening again? And so then the next thing you hear out of their mouth, I want to make sure that we never have another crash like the crash of October '87. And what are you doing, Madam Chairman, to prevent that from ever happening? You know, it's like right there. And that's the same thing. And groups like this are important. You know, who was it? Was it Phil or was it Reagan who said it? But if you hold somebody's, especially a politician's, feet to the fire, okay, that if you beat up on that guy, if that guy's getting, I know this is the way, Reagan said if you, meaning the public, hold the congressman's feet to the fire, you know, he'll do the right thing. Phil says that the special interests are beating on him over on the one side, including the press, saying regulate more, do more government intervention, etc. So if you have the other people, the general public, beating up on this side, saying, don't you dare do it, don't you dare do it, okay, you equalize the pressure, and then they'll generally do the right thing. And I'll give you an example of that. Was it a week ago, when the House, with Newt Gingrich's help, all right, defeated the president's crime bill, which I call the criminals bill, okay, on a procedural vote by one vote, all right? That was dramatic, and I think that really had a big effect on health care as well as the crime bill in the Senate, and this is why. The reason why it passed on the House side was not only the leadership of Newt Gingrich and folks like him, but those guys had to be reelected this fall, every single last one of them, and they're worried about it, okay? They're worried about it, and their constituents were telling them, and the constituents also knew, you know, not stupid. They knew, but they were also communicating that. These guys had to be reelected, and that's why the vote was close. My worry at that time was that the Senate, okay, doesn't have those pressures. Only a third of them are up, okay? So they can be free from the pressures, okay? So I worried a little bit about the Senate side, but I think the message that came through was so strong because nobody expected it. I mean, this was going to be rolled over. I mean, look at what they did. If you stop and think about it, look what they did. Conference committee, let's go back to Government 101. House passes a bill, the Senate passes a bill. Some differences, like if you have differences in funding, they're supposed to go to conference. You'd think they'd end up someplace in the middle. One it's going to cost $28 billion, another one it's going to be $32 billion, so you're supposed to end up somewhere in the middle and compromise. So what did the conference, what did they do? They came out, it was going to cost more than either bill. I mean, so that's what they thought. They thought they could get away with it, right? And so nobody was talking about the crime bill really not passing. I mean, there were some people worried about it, but bam! I mean, it was so shocking that it really sent a message, and I think it made a lot of difference. Yeah? The pluses and minuses of term limits, I think you've already stated them. That some people argue that, gee whiz, since a congressman can't learn that stuff, that is, he'll be more dependent on staff, and the committee staff might be more important, and therefore they would be more powerful, and therefore nothing would change. Now, that makes a lot of assumptions. One is the congressman's going to listen to his staff, right? And that two, that he's going to go with the staff more often than with his constituents who might, in this case, have a different view from staff. Let's make that assumption. But you could have a situation where that would occur, that people just don't know the issues. It's, again, a 10-second, 10-minute attention span, and they just do whatever somebody tells them to. I also think that you have a problem of not only the bureaucracy, but you also still have the same issues of the special interests and the press, et cetera, all bringing those pressures. However, on the plus side, in my view, on term limits, try anything. It may not be perfect, but we don't know for sure how people are going to respond. I do think that a lot of the new members of Congress that are coming in, for example, and there are lots of new ones, they're not just listening to their own staff. I mean, they might have staff to help them understand how to move around in Washington, et cetera, show them where the bathrooms are and things like that. But that doesn't mean on policy that they listen to them all the time. But there's a real plus about, you know, it's worth trying something, sending a message. Ultimately, though, I do think that if people get involved, and I think that the electorate is getting involved, they're going to send some folks home before they're 10 years. And a good example, there are some good examples out there. Some of the folks who have supported, for example, some of these programs that have been very unpopular. The last person, this poor person, the last person that Clinton got to vote on his tax increase package, all right? That poor person behind in the polls got 26%, I think, up to the opponent. I mean, because that person, you know, committed to the president, if you need my vote, but not if you don't need it. But if you need it, I'll vote with you. And they needed it, because it was that close. They needed the one vote. And that person is going to get not going to get elected again, probably. And the electorate is saying, and that's after 2 years. Yeah.
Your experience in CLTC, could you comment on the probability of a Yale lawyer making $100,000 and trading calendar?
I've been forgetting to repeat the questions, all right? And I think, I didn't hear the question, but I think it was a comment on cattle futures. And Hillary Clinton's very profitable trades. Let me say that we're glad to see speculation in these markets. And I'm very pleased that the president and Hillary, in speculating, made a lot of money. That, that maybe they shouldn't be so critical of other people who make money in various endeavors. And let's put it that way. And we're assuming that they made it all appropriately and following the rules. But those are markets that futures markets are markets where we've been very plain spoken. That speculation, if you view speculation really and truly as what it is, it's people who are willing to take risks as well. And speculation isn't necessarily bad. I mean, I would argue that those of you who are investing in all these things you're investing in, including in your homes and in your other equity portfolios, that there's a lot of that is speculation as well. And so speculation isn't that bad. It's taking risks. And these markets are markets where people do they use markets to hedge and to manage their risks. But they're always very accommodating and want to have people who are willing to take risks as well. Question? Not? Thank you very much. Appreciate having you here this morning.